flaws everything. The flaw is the story. This is what a lot of newbies aren't getting. It is what everything is about.
Yeah.
It's the DNA out of the whole thing. This is why we're putting them on this journey.
Welcome to the Scriptcake podcast. I am your host, Lavinder Gill, and this week we are excited to welcome Jill Chamberlain to the podcast. Jill is the founder of a screenwriting school, a script consultant, a screenwriter, and the author of The Nutshell Technique, Crack the Secret to Successful Screenwriting, which I'm holding up right here. As a script consultant, Jill has fixed and fine-tuned scripts for Oscar-nominated screenwriters, television showrunners, award-winning independent filmmakers, and many spec script writers. Screenwriters she's consulted for have made over $1 billion at the box office. She's the founder of the Screenplay Workshop with Jill Chamberlain, which you can find at thescreenplayworkshop.org, where she has personally taught thousands of screenwriters feature film and episodic television writing. Complete beginners to Emmy-winning screenwriters enroll in her classes. Find out more about her and her script consultancy at jillchamberlain.com. Welcome to the podcast, Jill.
Why, thank you. It is my pleasure to be here. Excited to talk about story structure.
Absolutely. Loved your book, and I want to get into that shortly. But one of the things I always like to learn about someone who's in the industry is what their origin story is. How did you get into screenwriting and filmmaking?
Yeah, so I was a frustrated screenwriter. I actually getting into screenwriting is a longer story. I had several careers in the arts that did not pan out. I started as an actress, and then I worked briefly as a documentary filmmaker, and then I wanted to be a director and directed some shorts. And then I found screenwriting, which I found the most satisfying of all of those. But I still had frustrations, and I'd had a little bit of paid work, like my first work for hire jobs, but it was not going to be enough to live off of. And I kept coming up against a roadblock where I was getting a note, and then the note was in slightly different words, but essentially the note was, this is a situation, not a story. And I knew there was a problem because I knew I did not doubt this note. I understood there was something missing that kind of made it to make it pop, make it, affect people. But I could not figure out how to fix that. And no one could tell me. No one could explain that to me. And so I stopped writing. I just was at a roadblock. I could tell I cannot fix this problem. My writing is always going to suffer until I fix this problem. And I should say I've had very good training. I was fortunate enough to go to Columbia University. I also studied in a private program with a mentor of mine named Doug Katz. Both very good training. But I needed someone who could basically, you see out there linear approaches to story, right, to plot, and you see character development, and they tend to be taught separately. And the problem I was experiencing, I could tell it lies exactly where these things have to intersect, but no one was explaining the intersection. And so I stopped working. I stopped writing and started analyzing movies and trying to identify the essential elements for telling a story. I watched, I'm not going to say thousands of movies, but I watched over 100 movies purely for structural things, looking for these structural elements, some of which I had been individually pointed out to me, but trying to find a universal system that brought them all together.
Mhm.
And then one day it fell together, and I was like, oh, holy crap, here are these 8 elements that really are required if you are going to tell a story and not just present a situation. And so that's the birth of that method.
I can't tell you what a breath of fresh air it was to read that because as someone, again, I probably taught a few thousand people myself in my screenwriting career. Um, there's so many people writing screenplays about nothing,
Yeah.
about stuff happening for no reason. And if you ever do get a chance to check out my book, there's a lot of things and phrases that we have that are very similar to each other. Though the way that you approach it is completely different and unique from the way that I think about it. But I do agree with you. It is such a big issue that, you know, the term I use is they're writing concepts. They're not writing stories, they're writing concepts. Okay, it's
The
about
premises, the premises. People
right,
have they come with a premise, but they don't. A premise is not a story, right?
right.
A situation is not a story. Right. A story involves a journey, and involves a Well, we'll get into all that involves, right? But yes, absolutely. People have premises or concepts, and but they don't know what they're trying to tell.
And one of the things that you mentioned in your book that I think is incredibly valuable is that it's all about the protagonist. Like if you remove the protagonist and it still works, it's not designed properly. It's not going to work if it's done properly because the protagonist is such an integral part about that. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. So I one thing first of all is I try to tell people that they should think of the protagonist and structuring around her as a structuring device, first of all. So like don't get upset when I say there's one protagonist, it could be a buddy picture. It could be an ensemble picture. I'm not saying you have to, delete those other characters. I'm saying and frankly, it's for the writer's advantage to, the audience doesn't have to know this.
Right.
Audience can think it's an ensemble picture. Let them think that. It's to your advantage to know that only one character has to have this full nutshell journey.
Right.
Most of your characters are going to go on journeys of sorts, but only one character is the one that structures and holds in everything. Um,
You had two
because,
examples in your book. I
yeah.
think one was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and the other
Mm-hmm.
was Harold and Kumar.
Harold and Kumar
So,
Vice Castle, right? Two great double feature putting those together, right? And it again, audience doesn't. Most people in the audience don't perceive a difference about who's going to be the protagonist. But it is unless they think structure in some ways or story. But it makes your life so much easier as a writer to know that one of the characters is the protagonist and that's the backbone. There are other elements, right? Obviously, of screenwriting other than story structure, but this is the backbone to identify this. And it's why I call it the nutshell technique. It's your story in a nutshell, right? It's identifying on one page what your story is about. And we do that by looking at the protagonist and the protagonist journey and the plot things that are happening to them, as a way to get a bird's eye view of trying to understand what it is you're trying to tell. So many writers don't know what they're trying to tell, right? They just come in with a bunch of plot. They're excited about a bunch of events,
mhm.
and I like to point out that life is a situation. Life isn't a story.
No.
Life is not a story. It's inherently not a story. People come to me with real life events they want to write about. That's great. There are a lot of great movies that have been made about it. But I warn them that's going to be the most difficult kind because you're dealing with dang facts that are getting in your way. And you're going to have a real open mind about how to structure someone's life or events in a life in such a way that tells a satisfying story.
No, again, I couldn't agree more. I take it even a step further. I try to design everything out of my protagonist. Okay, for example, once I figure out what my protagonist's emotional wound is, I will rip that out of their heart, plant it, water it, and I will grow the antagonist out of it. So the
Right.
antagonist is the living embodiment of their emotional wound. So when
Hmm.
they defeat the antagonist, they in effect defeat their own emotional wound. And it's like, and that's exactly the kind of places that you're going with this, where all the little things line up with the protagonist journey. Um, it took me, I remember probably grad school, where I realized that, a first act break should have something to do with the second act break. They shouldn't be two completely different.
Yeah.
But the way that it's taught is like it's just this point and it's this point and it's this point. And you don't realize they're all connected by a string and all part of the same journey. I was writing this thing that was a love story about this guy who goes to court and his ex-girlfriend is defending the other person, and it was about a bank robbery. And I'm like, well, if it's a love story, shouldn't it be about a divorce? And it just made so much more sense as I, started connecting those pieces. And again, your book is one of the only ones that talks about how they're connected so inherently. Now,
Thank you.
one of the things that you talk about, that I have not seen in other books, is the setup want. Okay, I know in my book I talk about the want and the need of the protagonist, and in mine, the first half they're chasing the want, the second half they're chasing the need. But you have this thing called the setup want, which is slightly different than the want. Can you expand upon that and explain what the difference is?
I can try. It's as you pointed out. I wrote two chapters. It's the one element I actually wrote two chapters on because it's that confusing. But it was one of the big light bulb moments for me of realizing that, because I had been taught that your protagonist should get their want in what happens at the 25% mark. But so often it didn't look like they were getting their want. And so what I realized is, and that's why I redefined it as a setup want. This
Mm,
is the want that sets up the story. I
mm,
like to think of the want, the setup want, as being the irony icing on the cake. Because what we're doing is we're setting up, be careful what you wish for. On some level, your protagonist asked for this to happen.
mhm,
They're going to get it in a very different way than they intended. But they're not, what we're doing is we're making sure that they're not victims, right? Even if your character is a victim in some senses of the word, they shouldn't just be, again, a story versus a situation, um, is that these specific events are happening to this character for a reason, the writer's reason, right? We're going to get them to face something in themselves they've never had to face.
mhm,
So sometimes the setup want is the same as the main want. Like I'm going to harp on or come to a couple of examples I use a lot. But for example, in Tootsie, his want is a job. He gets a job, right? But with this big catch that he's going to have to dress as a woman. That one's pretty clear.
right.
Most movies, it's not so clear. The thing they say they want, or that it's very obvious that they want, it very often appears they didn't get what they want. What I'm saying is they're getting something they want, right? It may not be the thing that they said they want. It may not be the most important want to them, but they're getting something that they want,
Mhm,
right? Because we're setting up, be careful what you wish for. And the classic example that really, it just drove this point home to me is the movie Groundhog Day, another great movie to all screenwriters should know. And this was I was watching the movie for the umpteenth time while I was reading three different versions of the script I found on the internet. And as you do when you're obsessed with structure, and I had a huge light bulb happen, because I realized the setup want is very clearly in the movie. It's not in any of the versions of the script I'd seen.
hmm,
And so it clearly came somewhat late in the process, which very often it does. And that's why I recommend writers fill in the want last, right? Because that's what they did with Groundhog Day. They filled it in last. So in Groundhog Day, his big one is he says that there's a network, one of the big networks is scouting him, right? That's his big want. Does he get that want? No, doesn't get that want. That doesn't drive the story. It is his most significant want, he would say, right? I'm not saying he doesn't want it. He said he wanted it. I believe he wants it. It's not the want that sets up the story. The want that sets up the story is actually more of, it comes out of what seems like a throwaway line. And so this is what they added in the movie. It's not going to be in any of the versions of the script or the original scripts you're going to see, where they added a little bit where he's about to go to Puxatawny and there's a substitute weatherman who's supposed to cover for him. And this guy wants more airtime. And so he's kind of sucking up to Phil. the Bill Murray character, and he's like, take your time, spend another night in Puxatawny if you like, because I'll be happy to cover for you. And Phil's response is, please, like, I want to spend an extra second in Puxatawny.
Mm-hmm.
So I would phrase his want as to only spend 24 hours in Puxatawny.
Right.
When he wakes up at 25% and it's the same day again, he gets that want to
Mm-hmm.
only spend 24 hours in Puxatawny, right? It just has a big catch on it. And the catch is he's going to spend the same 24 hours again and again for eternity. So what they did there is, they did not have the benefit of me on the set to say, hey, you're missing the setup want. But they realized, obviously someone realized we're missing something.
Mm-hmm.
We're missing, even horrible Phil doesn't deserve to just be a victim of the universe playing this trick on him for no reason. He actually asked for it,
Mm.
right? He said, Puxatawny is so horrible, I don't want to spend more than a day there.
Right.
And the universe said, you know what? You're so horrible. We're going to grant you your wish. You only have to spend one day there, but you're going to have to spend the same day there until you get it right.
Yeah.
Right? So he's not a victim. That's the big difference. He's not a victim of just this bad thing happened to him. He actually asked for it on some level. So I just call it the setup want, again, just to there's a lot of confusion about what the want is and what is the driving want of a story, and want versus need, right? And just to clarify that this is the want that sets up the story, and it has to be something that they get.
Now, why is it important that they get it?
Because otherwise they're a victim. Otherwise, what's happening to them has nothing to do with them and their desires. That they are, so it's just random crap happening to someone. The story is not random crap happening to someone,
Right.
right? It's you, the writer, and you may be working with a story that's based on true life, and that creates some of its own challenges. Or it could be, 100% fiction. But ultimately, for it to be a satisfying story, we need to see a character being tested by things they actually asked for, and not just, the universe playing random tricks on them. That's a situation.
Right. No, when I was reading the book, I started just kind of going through different films in my head. And of course, one of the first ones that pops up is Star Wars. And of course, Luke goes, well, I want to go fight in the rebellion. And he gets his wish, but it cost him his aunt and uncle and all this.
Hmm.
The catch is massive. And that's that burden that he has to carry throughout the rest of the journey. But
And the catch should be massive,
yeah,
right? Because the catch, that's super important. So many people write, setups, and they have a great point of no return at 25%, but it doesn't contain, well, it's actually not great by definition if it doesn't contain a big catch. You have to have a big problem. This is the problem that the protagonist thinks everything is about. This is what we, the audience, think the movie is about, right? Nothing's really happened, nothing much significant until that point of no return catch, right? So the point of no return gives them something they want, but it also gives them something they don't want. And that's the catch. And that's what they think ostensibly the movie's about, right? That's what second act is all about, dealing with that catch.
that's that, like you just said a few seconds ago, be careful what you ask for.
Yeah,
The one
exactly.
example that you used in the book that really hit home with me was when you were actually having difficulty with yourself for the movie Juno, and the realization that you came to was like eye opening for me. Can you share that example?
Yeah, it was so it was a rare example I gave you with showing my flaw, and strength of humility, by admitting I was wrong. That I had initially identified a different want in the movie. So I assign for my ongoing classes, I assign a movie every week. And Juno I assigned, and I thought I had nutshelled it correctly. And I had a want in there that kind of worked, which should have that should have been a clue right there, because if it's kind of working, it's not really working. And when the week went by and my students came back in, and I asked them what the nutshell is, one of my students had a much better answer than my answer. So the point of, and so I'm going to have to identify the point of no return, which is what I call what happens at 25%, in order for the want to make sense. And so the point of no return um, in Juno is when she goes to have the abortion and realizes she can't do it. That she's reminded by this pro-life student who's protesting, that is told that her baby has fingernails, and all of a sudden all she can see are people scratching, and she can't go through with it. And so the want that my student identified was that she wants to save something that is being discarded, right? So it's a great example of a throwaway line. It's a throwaway line, but it's not a throwaway sentiment, right? So it's, and I'm guessing, I bet they put that scene later. They added that first scene, right? So the first scene, she has no idea she's pregnant. She doesn't know what's happening. And the story hasn't really begun, but she says it began with a chair, right? And she's remembering when she got pregnant, when she and slept with her friend Polly, I think his name is, that they had sex, and she's identifying this chair, the same chair, or no, I guess it's a different chair that she sees, and says, this is the finest discarded living room set I've ever seen, or something, right? She wants to, someone's trying to throw out a chair. She decides to save the chair. So the want my student identified was she wants to save something that's being discarded. Right. And so she gets that in her point of no return of discovering she can't have an abortion. The big irony is it's a baby that she as a 16-year-old is utterly unprepared for dealing with. Right. And that is what all of second act is dealing with. And so the brilliance of that line, even though it's a little bit of it seems like a throwaway line, and I'm guessing was a scene added maybe on the late side. It also, I'm not saying it's a totally throwaway sentiment. It speaks to her character. That's the kind of person she is. She's the kind of person who wants to save things that are being discarded. She's got hamburger phone, and even her romance with Polly, is a little bit of a person who's been discarded. So it fits with her character. It doesn't come out of the blue, right? But it's not a big, deep, deep want, in the most traditional senses of that word.
No, the insight to that thought process was pretty powerful. And it was like, it clarified it for me when, the same struggle you have, the same struggle I think a lot of people will have, because it's not an easy concept to wrap your head around. But it starts to make a lot of sense. And now I'm going to start looking back at my scripts and go, did I have them have a want that they got
Yeah.
at the beginning or not? And
Yeah.
I think a couple of them I did. I'm like, oh, they did. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting how sometimes you just do stuff and you don't know why you're doing it, but then you read something like your book and it just clarifies, like, oh, okay, that's why that's happening. And I'm sure there's plenty of times where I haven't done it, where I need to go back and fix it. So one of the really interesting things about your book is that you don't spend a lot of time talking about what I think a lot of people struggle with, which is a second act. You know what I mean?
I do.
And so tell me why you don't need to spend time on that. Why is it
Yeah.
so clear to you?
Yeah, this is something I feel pretty strongly about, right? That and one of the things that makes my method very different than other books that deal with structure. Other books that deal with structure typically are going to present a linear point of view. They're going to tell you have to hit 15 or 22 or however many pre-prescribed story beats, right?
I think
Um,
Save the Cat and Truby and those two are right there, 15.
Yeah, and I've also seen 120. I've seen all sorts of numbers, right? I'm not naming names,
Uh,
but most deal with specific beats. That's not what I do. That what I strongly believe is that if we set up these things in Act 1 and Act 3 properly, and that's not easy, by the way, right? But if we follow all these, we find a want that they get, and that is they ironically feel the opposite about in 75%, et cetera. If we set it up properly, that does all the heavy lifting of supporting all of Act Two, even though Act Two is twice as long an act than Act One or Act Three is on their own, right? So um, people obsess, I think, a little bit about these specific beats you have to hit in the middle. You don't. You absolutely don't. Some people use my method with other beat sheet methods, and I'm fine with that. If it can work hand in hand with Save the Cat and Truby and these other methods. They don't contradict each other. The problem, though, with strictly linear methods is that you can, if you can follow them and still end up not telling a story, because what they don't do is explain the connection between the parts. And mine is all about the parts. I only have that many. I mean, I don't have that many linear beats in it. I mean, we have your screenplay is going to have a first scene, and it's going to have a last scene. And then there's something that happens at 25%, and there's something that happens at 75%, right? Those are the only, kind of landmarks that I think you need to hit. Structure-wise, linear structure-wise. The rest of my beats are about or not beats, excuse me. The rest of my elements are about, in the nutshell, about the connection, what connects those four moments. They are not four random moments. They are connected, right? There's a relationship to what happens at 25% with the want and what happens at 75%, right? There's a relationship with what happens at 75% and in the very last scene of the movie with the flaw, which is not a moment in time at all, right? So I strongly believe that if you set up these things properly in Act One and Act Two, and then one other caveat is that you continue to maintain conflict. You have to continue to throw obstacles at your protagonist. You don't need those pre-prescribed beats. If you like to use, and I tell my students, if you like to use them, use them. That's great. I had someone come up to me at Austin Film Festival actually and ask if I could sign his book, and I was very flattered to do so. And he said, "Can I really throw out my copy of Save the Cat?" And I said, "Do you like Save the Cat? Because if you like Save the Cat, you can use my book and Save the Cat. There's no reason you can't." And he said, "No, I hate Save the Cat." And I said, "Well, then you can throw it out. If you respond to this better, throw it out. There's absolutely no reason you have to follow those, right? As long, again, I got to say that caveat again, you have to set things up properly and do the whole nutshell. In other words, set up things properly in Act One and Act Three, and find the flaw and strength that glues them all together. You don't have to predetermine those beats. You won't run, everyone runs out of steam, right? In Act Two, it's probably because they didn't set things up right. Someone, I'm going to forget the famous person who said, the problem in your third act is in your first act. Someone famous said that. I can't remember who, right? And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Those, if you're having problems, and also if you're sputtering out in Act Two, the problem is you don't know your ending probably.
Right. I couldn't agree more. I can't tell you how often I will go watch a movie and at the beginning it's about this father and this daughter, and then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that happens that has nothing to do with it. And at the end they hug and they've solved their problems because the father has saved the daughter. And I'm like, those are not connected in any way, shape, or form. It's not emotionally satisfying. It's entertaining because you get to see explosions and stunts and things like that. But again, I can't harp about how important it is that all of these beats are connected. I don't want to go through all the beats because I want people to have a reason to buy your book and take your class.
Sure.
I do want to talk about the flaw.
Oh, I love talking about the flaw.
All right. Well, I got plenty of them myself. Can you talk
Me
about the
too.
flaw?
Flaws everything. The flaw is the story. This is what a lot of newbies aren't getting. It is the story. It is what everything is about.
Yeah.
It's the DNA out of the whole thing.
Preach.
This is why we're putting them on this journey. They're
That's
having to, this is why they're not a victim also, because they, even if terrible things are happening to them, and and just a side note, of course, I'm not saying someone deserves those terrible things most of the time. But the thing that makes them a protagonist is that despite the bad things happening to them, there's something in them that is making things worse for themselves. And this awful thing happening to them is getting them to face something they never were going to face. They were going to keep on their whole life never having faced whatever this flaw was. And so I love talking about the flaw, and it's something we talk about a lot in my class. And by the way, I should say with all my clients as well. And I always tell people to dig deeper, right? So the flaw. Let me just be clear about how I define it. The flaw means something internal that we can judge them for, that they have control over. So it is, and I would even say something like alcoholism, I wouldn't call a flaw for our purposes. I would call that's really behavior that we would ask, well, what is the flaw that creates the alcoholic? Because there are different types, right? Somebody could be an alcoholic because they're selfish. Another person could be, alcoholic because they've just lost all faith in themselves. They're different things. So let's dig deeper. What is the thing underneath it that they have, that this thing they've been doing that they think serves them that is not serving? And with a story, the idea is that all of a sudden, boom, something happens to them that they don't even realize that it's getting them to face something in themselves they never were going to face. So that's why it is the story.
My God, I almost want you to say that again because people need to hear that that's the whole kit and caboodle. There's these two things that you use throughout your book that are fantastic. One is talking about the flaw, which I call the emotional wound in mine, but same difference. And then opposites. You have opposites throughout your structure, and you talk about it in a number of different ways. Can you talk about the power of opposites in terms of storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, two very distinct ways that they appear in the nutshell would be the flaw, strength, and then also the want and the crisis. And so the flaw, the strength is, we talked about how the flaw is essential. It is the story. And so if the story is, and I should clarify, I break stories into Aristotelian comedies and tragedies, right? And so these things are going to be different. And most stories are Aristotelian comedies, which means simply the protagonist has a happy ending and they learn something, right? I'm oversimplifying it a bit, but that's generally what we mean. It does not mean ha ha comedy. These, as the name would suggest, come from Aristotle. And as I tell my students, if you don't like the definitions, you can blame him. But that is how he defined a comedy. It's where the hero overcomes the flaw, and as a result, they get a happy ending. And so, and tragedy, though, is an opposite, is where the hero fails to overcome the flaw and they fail to have a happy ending. And so, in a comedy, we're going to see the protagonist go from a flaw to its opposite, which I call a strength. And so they're going to be continue their flawed way throughout Act One, throughout Act Two. And it's not until they hit the rock bottom of the crisis that they finally start to change and finally reach the polar opposite of the flaw that they had in the beginning. So, to use one of my examples, I've used Tootsie, right? Is his flaws, he doesn't respect women. By the end, having gone through this journey, literally walking in women's shoes, he has learned respect for women, right? A tragedy, the protagonist is not going to move away from the flaw. I still tell people on my tragedy form I think it's important to identify what the strength would have been so that so that you understand, again, that your character's not a victim, that had he or she made a positive choice in the climax towards the strength, they could have had a happy ending. But we see, and we want this feeling of like, why did you make that choice? That's the choice. They make that flawed choice instead, and that gives them their sad ending. And then the other big opposites are what happens with the setup want, and then in a comedy at the crisis, which is what I call what happens at 75%. And this is something I'm I think different, somewhat different than I think most people, where the crisis is not just the dark night of the soul, right? It's not just their lowest moment, although it should have also, that's also an important criteria. It
Mhm.
should be their lowest moment. And this is something where people, I see writers very often not coming nearly low enough.
Mhm.
And you'll see on my checklist, I say, is that really the lowest you could take the character? Like, what if everything you said, plus they were in jail, plus they were suicidal?
Mhm.
Because that's the lowest we can go. We're suicidal, right? You see that in every single Frank Capra movie. The It's a Wonderful Life. Uh, Meet Joe Black, I think is the name of it. And Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And all three of those movies, the protagonist is suicidal at the crisis.
Hmm.
Just that's just a benchmark to keep in mind. Are you truly taking your character the lowest? So it's the lowest, but it's also, this is the tricky part, and this is why the want is tricky, is because it's the lowest and it's the opposite of what they want.
Mhm.
So again, we're doing a little bit more of that irony icing. The thing that you thought you wanted, you now, it's not that you didn't get the want, it's now that you hate the thing you want. You've gone a full 180 on that. You thought you wanted an acting job more than anything. At 75%, you want out of this acting job more than anything. In Groundhog Day, he wants to only spend 24 hours in Puxatawny. At 75%, he's finally had this amazing day with the Rita character and told her the truth about what's happening. And as she's falling asleep, he says, and you know what the worst part is? Tomorrow, you're going to think I'm a jerk again. He wants the day to last forever.
Mhm.
What great irony is that,
Yeah.
right? The whole movie's been trapped trying to get out of this, and he just wishes this day could last forever,
Yeah.
right? So that's what we're doing.
It gets me emotional just thinking about it.
Good, should, right? And we kind of, to get emotional, you really have to take your character as low as you can go, and also show they've completely changed. They've completely changed they haven't completely changed personality, right? They still need the third act to finally gain the strength. But they finally have realized that thing I coveted so much has brought me nothing but misery.
Yeah.
And I need to rethink. And I have a crisis of faith now, right? And I might be suicidal because everything I thought I knew, I now disagree with, right?
No, it's one of the things I always get pushback on with a lot of students is when I start bringing up, emotional elements and you talked about how the story is the flaw and the emotional wound is the flaw. But I'm writing an action movie, but I'm writing a comedy, but I'm writing it. And they don't seem to understand that you can take whatever genre you want, but you gotta have this emotional baseline going in every story for it to work. Do you ever have any difficulty getting people to understand that?
Only in the sense that, I mean, I make a pretty convincing case pretty early on that it doesn't matter what the genre is, that this is the story. So unless someone just completely disagrees with the entire philosophy of the nutshell technique and something, then um, they're actually pretty quickly, they see what I'm saying. They just aren't sure how to implement it. And maybe there's a little doubt, until they actually see it in when they turn in a beat sheet or they turn in a script and they realize, oh, that makes a huge difference, right? That's going to take it. I thought it was all about action and explosions and this fun thing that no one's ever done before. And those things can be great, but it just was not affecting anyone. No one cared and everyone lost interest. And now that I focused on bringing out, well, what flaw is John McClane facing
Mm.
as he's dealing with this, right? That makes it the compelling story that we care about.
Yeah. No, it's some of the examples you use are so beneficial. Like you brought up Tootsie. You take someone who doesn't respect women and you make them be a woman.
Yeah.
Like how much more clear could that be that he's going to learn something from that experience?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
other ones are not so easily identifiable.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
talk about that in the book. You talk about like you got to work at this. You can't. This isn't something where you're going to read it and go, okay, the whole world is clear to me now. It is something that is there, and you've got to start. You said digging for a different reason, but you got to also start digging to find these patterns throughout all the different movies that you see going on.
Yeah, you got to practice, right? If this is a new, it is a bit of a new framework, and I tell my students they should be nutshelling everything they see. And I let me just say, I really want to emphasize people should start with the act breaks. Don't start with that want. Don't start with the want. We always want to start with the want. That's going to throw you off most of the time. Most movies are not like Tootsie, where you guess the want and that drives everything. Act breaks should jump out at us. Sometimes when I assign a difficult movie for my students, and I'll say, I'll warn them, this is a difficult nutshell. But if you are confused, I want you to turn to your spouse who you're watching this with and ask them, what is this movie about? And what is the climax?
Mhm.
Because they're going to be able to identify it. They're not intellectualizing it like we are. We should feel those two moments in our gut,
Hmm.
right? They should affect us in our gut, right? We feel, oh, everything changed at the point of no return, and oh, this is a climax, right? Those should jump out at us. Then we intellectualize. Well, what do they represent, right? What flaw are we moving? Then we look at what those represent, those different pieces, right? But start there with everything you watch. And by the way, it applies to television exactly, episodic television exactly the same. So if you're, trying to learn episodic television structure, every time you watch an episode of television, look for those, and I don't want to say act breaks because the structure is a little different on the script, but look for those two big moments. Every episode of television should have them. What is the big event that makes this episode this episode? And if it hadn't happened, it would have been some other show or not this show. And what is the climax of that episode? So that should be in every single episode, should be in every single feature film, as long as it's telling a story. Little caveat there. There are some, it's not very common, but there are some movies that don't tell a story, like a movie, some of Richard Linklater's movies like Slacker and Boyhood, are more, about slices of life
Mhm.
than they're about a story. But the vast majority of movies and TV shows are stories, right? So look for those, and it will help you to realize, oh, I didn't realize I could have a climax that involves this. So yeah, you should study it if you really want to master structure.
No, I think it's important. So you're saying when you're analyzing it, look for the act breaks. But
Start there.
let's look at it from the other side. Let's say I'm writing a story. What should I think about first? Because most people default to genre, it seems to me, or concept. What do you recommend a writer? What's the first thing they should come up with from which to build their story?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on the writer. I don't know how one approaches it. I tend to be a premise person.
Okay.
I tend to be, what if what if somebody woke up and it was the same day as yesterday? That's a great premise. I start with that and I start to structure. Then I think about who would be the most interesting character to put in that dynamic.
Mhm.
But I don't know that there's necessarily a right or a wrong for that. But once we get to that, and I would then look at those act breaks again. Like again, don't I fall into the trap of the want too. But I have to remind folks, don't worry about the want. Don't worry about the want. Like let's find first what is the big event that makes this movie, and then let's start to find that climax. I have writers, I've hot, my fancy Hollywood writers come to me, they filled out their form, they're all excited to present it to me. And then and I tell them, first of all, I'm not going to be attached to anything you say, particularly that want, because so often it's going to change, just so you know. That's not a real helpful thing. You can tell me what you think it is, but I don't really care until we get to the climax. And I can't tell you how many people, including my $1 billion box office screenwriters, don't have a good climax. And if we don't have a good climax, I'm going to stop right now. We're going to stop right now. We're going to talk about that.
Hmm.
Because if you don't know your climax, if you don't know that ending of your story, you don't know your story. That defines what the story is, right? Are they going to learn and change? or are they not going to learn and change? And in what way? And so I try to get there pretty fast, actually. A lot of people aren't, a lot of people plunge in. They try to write it not knowing that. I think that's a terrible idea. You can do it, but you're going to write a lot more drafts that way, right? Because you're going to write to page 45 and run out of steam and being like, and back to the drawing board. And so I'm trying to prevent that. I'm trying to say, let's think story now. Let's try to design story, right? And figure out if they're starting here, where do you want them to end up? And can we find a really fresh and original way, particularly in that climatic choice, right? And it's not easy at all, but let's stop right now because there's no point in harping I see writers all the time who are like rewriting first acts and never proceeding. That's the terrible idea. In my workshops, we do not look at your script until it's finished. We will not look at a partial script. We're going to make you, even if it's a bad ending, I want you to try to write an ending because it's kind of irrelevant just looking at the beginning. I mean, we can scene study and look at your screenwriting ability on the page, and I actually do writing exercises like that. But as far as story, if you don't know your ending, you don't know your story.
No, that's great advice. I know plenty of people who've written the same 30 pages, 10 times. They could have had 3 feature scripts written in the time that they're still working on page 31. And it's like, it
Yep.
doesn't make sense to me. Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. So, all right, I have a question about one of the stories you talk about in here. You talk about the movie Argo and how you don't like one of the elements, um, the climactic choices, telling his boss is responsible for them and he's defying orders. And you're saying that doesn't connect in any way to the flaw, which is choosing career over family.
Or family of no, sorry, yes, you're correct. The flaw is choosing yes.
So let me
Yeah.
ask.
And I should say it's not that I hated the movie, right? I just wanted to point out ways it could have been stronger. I feel like it was a missed opportunity to
I
make
don't,
it a little more stronger
I don't-
to his, it left me I thought I would have been more affected by it, and I kind of wasn't because of that.
no, I don't disagree. I remember watching it and thinking, okay, that's fine. And then, just kind of moved on with my life. It didn't like hit me like a lot of movies do hit me. But I have a question just for my own clarity, because when I was reading it, I started trying to remember. Now I haven't seen the movie in God knows how many
Yeah, I
years.
have not in a while. I'm flipping through my book as we speak because I'm like, oh dear, what are you going to ask me about? Okay,
I don't even know what page
I
I'm on.
found it. I found it.
Okay, 137, I think I'm on. Yeah. Um,
Hmm.
so the question is, he is defying orders. So he's not taking job over everything right there. Is that safe to say?
He is defying orders. Correct.
Right.
Yes.
And so, metaphorically, I just wanted to ask, is it possible that he's treating the hostages as family? No, maybe.
I mean, do you emotionally feel that?
Uh,
Like, not looking at the page, looking at your memory of the movie.
I don't have any clue. I mean, it made no impact on me, so I don't.
Yeah. I mean, we certainly didn't see that demonstrated,
Okay.
right? I mean, it was just the mission, right? I mean, honestly, that didn't seem, I don't feel like he had any stronger emotional connection with them at the climax than he did in Act Two.
Yeah, it's one of those like I talked about earlier where, he leaves because there's a disagreement or something, and he comes back and they hug and everyone's happy.
Yes.
Mm,
Exactly. Just and it was so close, right? I thought it could have been more connected. I think, like you said, making the hostages family, right? True. If I truly felt that, that sounds way more interesting to me,
mm,
right?
all right,
So you and I, we could have fixed it,
we could have
right? Tell the Academy they should take that Oscar and reconsider
if they'd have
it.
only called. So something you talked about earlier, and I wanted to get to it, but you were in a groove, so I didn't want to interrupt you. You were talking about these forms that you have. Are those available anywhere?
In fact, they are. Your readers can, or I'm sorry, listeners can download them for free off of my website. So they go to jillchamberlain.com/worksheets. You
Okay.
can download and it's a separate form for comedy and tragedy. You can see the method, see if you like it. I'd love it if they bought the book, but go ahead and get the worksheets to see if you respond to it first. And I think 16,000 people have downloaded those worksheets so far, and I'm happy to see that that's happening. And so I wish people luck with it. Yeah.
No, it's nice to have a visual reference to kind of see it. It's one thing to talk about it, and wax poetic about it, but actually see it in front of you and go, okay, this goes here, that goes there, and that goes there. It's
Because
very
it is very visual. It is. It's a schematic. And that's, I mean, that's part of the design. Is it's a one piece of paper. We
Mhm.
can see these 8 elements right on the paper, and you can see, the arrows help you point out if they're working together or not, right? As I said, if you don't need to worry about Act Two so much, as long as you set things up properly in Act One and Act Three, this shows you. You can, if you follow the directions, you can see right on there if it's working or not.
No, that's awesome. I've actually downloaded them myself, and I will put a link in the description to your
Great.
website so people can click on it. And I believe it's on the top right is where you can click on the free forms. So tell me a little bit about how your classes work. Like, are they just like a 10-week class, or how does it lay out?
Yeah. So it's a 10-week program. And so the idea is the goal is to finish a script, a feature script or a TV pilot in 10 weeks. It's a
Mhm.
pretty aggressive goal. But I like aggressive goals. I think that's good for people. Deadlines, right, make a huge difference in actually getting something done. And so what we do, I limit it to, it's all on Zoom now. I used to do it in person, but I've started doing it during the pandemic all online. I'd done online before, but I told myself I didn't like it. And then the pandemic, I decided, well, I better learn to like it. And in fact, I've decided I like it better because I have my students are all over the world now. And so it doesn't limit me to where I'm living. And so in 10 weeks, what we're going to do is, and so I limit the full participants, the people who are actually submitting work, to 10 people. And then people can also audit for 145 bucks. It's a lot less expensive, but auditors don't get to participate. They're just watching. And so the idea is to go from nutshell to beat sheet to script, and also cover all the areas of the craft in between. And so every week I assign a movie that or a TV show in my TV writing class that folks are supposed to go home and try to nutshell, because I want people to start thinking structure.
Mhm.
And then they're also working on their own story nutshells. And so the first couple of weeks, we're getting those working, just meaning that all the 8 elements work together. And I obviously have a big part of this since I created this and I know it the best. But it's really helpful having 10 other people give you feedback too. And very often it's somebody else who helps you think of that climatic choice that is inevitable yet unexpected that you could not see in that ending you can't find. So we're working together, and it's I just love it when I see people speaking up, when someone's story is finally coming together, how they like, okay, now I can see it, now I can, now I get the bird's eye view, I get what your story is, I'm excited. And then the writer goes, after their nutshell's working, they go and they write a beat sheet, basically a story outline that they submit and that we do critiques on. And then once they do that, they're to write their script. And then meanwhile, I give lecture material on, all the areas of the craft, from, dialogue to formatting, all the going into specifics and giving exercises with that.
Okay,
So
so it's even further than your book. It's much more.
Oh, it is. It is. Yes, absolutely. My book is only about structure. And actually, my book does not mention one word of TV, even though it applies to TV. It does not mention that at all. Structure is a big part of my workshop because it's my workshop, and that's what I'm known for. And it's story structure, but it is by no means the only thing. Yeah, so we absolutely cover all the areas of the craft. And I'm a very strong believer in the importance of writing groups.
Mhm.
And so I'm try very much to get folks to form a writing group that's can continue after the workshop ends. They're always invited back. I give alumni a discount to encourage them to come back. But even if they don't, I want them to keep writing. And it is really hard to do that without, I think, a strong writing group. It makes, I mean, most of my writers who've been successful, it's because they not just had writing groups, they had intense writing groups,
Oh,
with very strict rules and, whatever that really kept people feeling accountable, but also feeling safe, that people really do think of these other members as family, frankly. I mean, I know people, they invite everybody to their weddings and so forth because they become family. These are people that you've been working with over years to develop stories, right? And so you very much trust their feedback. And that's so important to get us out of our little introverted, writer head and have some support from the outside world.
no, I think that's incredibly important. I had a writers group years ago, just me and two friends, and we held each other accountable 10 pages a week, hell or
Yep.
high water. And you're knocking out 4 or 5 features every year.
Yep.
That's where you learn how to write. You know what
Yep.
I mean? By just
Yep.
continually
I
cranking and cranking. So,
I have one story of a crazy strict writing group, if I may. And I have lots of stories, but I'm going to give you one of my writers groups that's super intense. And they've been around for years, and then they went to Austin Film Festival, and one of them saw a panel called "My Kick-Ass Writing Group" by the legendary group that 4 out of 5 people were Nichols winners or something. And she came back to the group and she was like, "Okay, guys, we got some real rules now." And she came back with all these rules, and one of them was there's no such thing as or that you could only have 2 excused absences or something. You had to, and this is pre-pandemic. If you couldn't physically be there, you had to Skype in. And I have seen the photographic evidence of one of the members of that group Skyping in to his writing group just minutes after his wife had given birth to his first child. He Skyped in from the hospital waiting room. I don't
wow.
think his wife was too thrilled, but that group had incredible success. That writer was a universal, won the Universal Fellowship. And he's with CAA. The woman who set up that group is now with CAA. None of them were with agents before this. She's with CAA. She's already staffed on a couple of shows. Somebody else did the Sundance Episodic Lab. This is a group of 5 people, and they are incredibly invested in each other, and they've gone to each other's weddings. And it just made all the difference in the world. They really do think of each other as family at this point.
I
Yeah.
had a class I took a few years ago, and we all really gelled. And then afterwards, one of the members reached out to everybody, said, let's just keep it going without the teacher because and after the second class, like a few people didn't submit work. And I just sent out an email, guys. I'm happy to be a part of the group, but if everyone's not going to be doing what they say they're going to be doing, then I don't need to be part of the group. And 2 weeks later, I was no longer part of the group because it was, it's a shame. But you're right.
Yeah.
It takes that kind of drive and push,
Yeah.
and people don't realize that, you don't just come up with an idea and write it and win an Academy Award and have a wonderful writing career. You got to grind and you got to work
Mhm.
at it. And I think that's a great example of the effort that goes into this process. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And you need outside perspective too, right? It's another important part. Yeah. That group also has a year-end review they do.
wow.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
do
I
I
told you.
join that group?
Yeah. They're no joke. They have a year-end review where everyone sits down. They say, you haven't been turning in enough pages. Are you going to change? Because maybe you shouldn't be in this group.
I
Yeah.
like it. Militant. I like it.
Yeah. It's
Well,
got
Jill
results.
Chamberlain, thank you so much for taking
Oh,
the time
you're
to speak to me.
so welcome.
The book is called The Nutshell Technique: Crack the Secret of Successful Screenwriting. And again, you can find the book and the free downloads on jillchamberlain.com. It's been an honor. Love the book. Can't wait to see what you do next, Jill.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed talking the story with you just a ton.
Absolutely the same. Until next time. Thank you so much for watching this video, and as a small token of my appreciation, I want to offer you a free video course on how to outline your screenplay. I normally charge $299 for this course, but for a limited time, it is free. Now, it is a 5-day course, but I'm giving you 7 days to finish this outline, okay? After 7 days, that course goes away. So if you're not dedicated and you don't want to knock out a killer outline for your screenplay, don't do it. But if you do, click the link below. I can't wait to hear how you like it.